The next slot is half an hour of a Zoom presentation. Marty Minehan is waiting, I think. Are you there, Marty? Hey, and there's welcome. So this is a really lovely segue, I think, because part of what came out of this last discussion with Jade and Lloyd was the extent to which we can use CME to address some of these challenges that we have, both around our cultural competence and culturally safe practice. And of course, we're in a really interesting space in terms of where our CME opportunities sit, given COVID and what's going on there. But before COVID, there's some really useful challenges being posed to us and by us, and certainly by a number of our members, about sustainable practices and how we utilise our CME. There is a very probably vanilla discussion document about CME usage and COVID in your conference pack, which we're also keen to get some feedback, and if people want us to bolster it up a bit, that's fine, but it's a starting point for a discussion. So, having just rather long-windedly introduced you, Marty, I'm going to hand over, I'm going to be quiet, and I'm just going to attend to the Slido questions as they pop up. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. So, tēnā koutou, tēnā ai, coming to you from Auckland via Zoom. I'm just going to start the screen sharing, and hopefully you can see the presentation. Yep, all good? Okay, so I was asked to talk about CME in the post-COVID era. But firstly, I just want to acknowledge two other people in this area, Rob Burrell and David Gallo. I think they're both there in person, I'm told. Rob and David are both quite active in this space. Rob's an anaesthetist at Middlemore, and he has a very strong environmental conscience, spends time talking to the registrars about the environmental impacts of anaesthesia. And Dave's an intensivist at Middlemore Hospital. He's also very active in this space, writes a lot of articles. You've probably seen a few of his stories in Newsroom. So just to acknowledge those two people as part of this discussion, and also to deflect some of the incoming criticisms that this talk will no doubt generate. So I was asked to give this talk on the back of an article that Rob and I co-authored that appeared in the latest specialist magazine, featured some clown on the cover eating a drug tray, and one of my colleagues down in Christchurch was very quick to send a parody photograph in return. So thanks, Dr. Ongley. So firstly, I'm just going to talk about what the problem is and what some of the inputs are, and then some discussion about how we might deal with some of this. So healthcare has a significant impact in terms of its carbon footprint, and for most large economies, it accounts for about 4% of the total global emissions of that country. And we're all aware of the impacts of climate change and what the future impacts will be, not only in our immediate environment, but in terms of healthcare, there will be some significant impacts for us as practitioners. Disease profiles will change, different types of vectors, different types of infectious diseases. There will be some significant social impacts and a lot of sort of political fallout. So it is an issue that requires attention, and something that as healthcare providers we need to take responsibility for, because, you know, although we focus on the health of our patients, in actual fact we are all part of an ecosystem, and we should be spending a bit of time focusing on the health of our planet. And I know this is a debated thing, but the dictum of first do no harm should also apply to our environment. So what are the inputs into the carbon footprint from the health sector? So these tend to get categorised into three scopes, scope 1, 2 and 3. So scope 1 are the direct impacts. So that's the direct outputs of an organisation. So when you're talking about a DHB, it's direct carbon input. And then scope 2 are the sort of external inputs, so those are like purchasing and stuff. And then scope 3 are things that we can't really control that much, but do have an impact on the output of our carbon footprint. There's a really good international organisation called Healthcare Without Harm. If you're interested in this subject, I strongly recommend you look this up. They are a international body that focuses on the environmental impacts of healthcare, covering large areas and a vast array of topics. They produce some really good documents from reducing the impact of the pharmaceutical industry to providing low impact food in hospitals. A very big resource, so definitely worth a look. So when we look at the top 10 emitters as a percentage of carbon footprint, so the United States is the biggest contributor in terms of healthcare carbon output, followed by China and then the Europeans and various other nations. And so when you look at that as a percentage of each individual country's output, I don't know if the cursor is working, but you can see that on average, for most countries, the healthcare contributes roughly 4.4% of a country's total carbon output. Some countries are larger than that. So the United States, for example, 7.6, and some of the other countries are significantly less than that. And that kind of reflects the level of healthcare activity in those countries. New Zealand, we sit at 4.1%, so 4.1% of our carbon footprint is generated from our healthcare activities, and that's mostly from carbon dioxide, but a little bit of nitrous in there as well. And New Zealand, when you look at New Zealand's profile, we've got this big area here called agriculture. It contributes almost 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and it's, I mean, I don't enjoy bashing our agriculture industry, but it is a significant contributor for this country. So where do we sit in terms of the rest of the world? So if you look at it, the tons of CO2 per capita, so this means that this is population adjusted now, you can see that Australia and the United States are very heavy emitters in terms of actual CO2 per capita. New Zealand sits at 0.42 tonnes per capita, and that's in the higher than average emitter, with the average being 0.28. So we're almost in the major emitter category. There was a bit of a typo in this chart up here, but I've corrected that underneath it. And then if you put that on a graph, you can see that this is New Zealand's total greenhouse gas per capita, so not just healthcare, so all of our emissions combined. And you can see that on a per capita basis, we're actually pretty high up there. We're not as high as Australia or the United States, but certainly in terms of a per capita emission, New Zealand has got a big problem. And that's again from agriculture. When you look at it, the breakdown by sector, you see that agriculture is a significant contributor for us. The United States and Australia, their per capita emissions are high because they're very fossil fuel dependent, particularly in their energy mix. Those two countries burn a lot of coal and burn a lot of oil in production of electricity. All right, so let's just focus a bit locally. So the data I'm going to present you now is publicly available data. So it's no secrets, and I'm quite entitled to disclose all this information to you and the general public. So when we look at ADHB's emission profile, this comes from our CMARS data that we've collected over the year, or more recently renamed Toitu and Envirocare. You'll see that the major contributor for ADHB year on year is natural gas. But then there's this big chunk underneath called air travel. And when you look at it as on a pie chart, you see that air travel on its own is the single largest contributor to the DHB's carbon footprint. 41% of our carbon output as a consequence of air travel. And when you break that down, over 90% of that air travel is SMOs engaging in CME activities. So if you break down the air travel by air travel type, we end up with this big wedge called long-haul business class. So that contributes 50% of the air travel carbon contribution, and if air travel's 40% of the total contribution, then 20% of the DHB's carbon footprint comes from long-haul business class travel. And when you look at that year on year, it's pretty consistent. I didn't have this year's data, but it got emailed to me late last night, so I've included that in a future slide. So you can see that year on year air travel is probably the largest single contributor in terms of the emissions inventory. So this is the slide that I received last night, and you'll notice a little bit of an interesting change in numbers in 2020, but we'll get to that. But you can see that we were sort of trending down a little bit, 2015, 16, 17, and then 2019, we kind of took a few steps back and back to where we were. And the other thing to note is that there is public awareness of this. So there's been a little bit of chatter in the media about DHB spending lots of money on long-haul business class trips, and people are becoming aware of the carbon emissions as a consequence of this activity. And also, New Zealand's introduced the Zero Carbon Act, so this is going to put legislative pressure on DHB activities in terms of their carbon output. And so you can imagine that when an external body is looking at a DHB's carbon emissions profile, the first thing they're going to see is this CME travel. So what's the problem with air travel? So air travel is actually a luxury. Only 11% of the world's population flew in 2018, and less than 4% of the world's population took an international flight. So the vast majority of people on the planet don't actually fly on an annual basis. So there are several impacts from flying. CO2 is the direct one. That's the one that everybody acknowledges. That's the one that the airlines acknowledge. That's the one that the aircraft manufacturers acknowledge. But there are some secondary consequences that contribute to global warming, and those are things like ozone contrails, cloudiness. These are hard to quantify exactly. Interesting, there are some slight cooling effects. There is a slight reduction in methane when you increase the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and the sulfates also kind of cool the planet a little bit, but those are minor. And when you look at air travel as a form of transport and compare it to the emissions of other modes of transport, you can see that air travel is the most carbon intensive mode of transport. So on a per kilometre basis, it's almost 4, 5 times, 6 times that of taking 4 people in a car the same journey. And when you want to compare that, so I don't know how many people flew from Auckland to Wellington, but if you did fly down, you just contributed 148 kilos of carbon on the way down, and you'll contribute another 148 kilos of carbon on the way back. If you were brave enough to take the train, you would have only generated 17 kilos, and if you drove down in your electric vehicle, you would have only contributed 14 kilos. Interestingly, the least carbon intensive modes of transport in New Zealand are train and electric vehicles, and so that's certainly an argument for electrification of our transport network. And then let's look at the effects of the different types of classes. So this is data from the World Bank and also from DEFRA. So a business class seat generates roughly 3 times the carbon footprint of an equivalent economy seat. And that's because of the actual floor space that that class of seat takes, and also things like the increased luggage allowance. And so both the World Bank and DEFRA, using different methods of calculation, have come up with roughly the same sort of ratio of impact. And so let's look at the highest emitting countries, and which countries generate the most carbon in terms of carbon from air travel. And so one method of doing that is looking at aviation bunker fuel use. And you can see that America, for example, is just off the charts. And notice the little blue arrow there. There's a change in scale of the axis there. And then New Zealand, we're kind of in the range of sort of Portugal, Belgium, Sweden. And then if you look at that as a share of the nation's carbon emissions, so this would be on a country by country basis, you can see that in New Zealand, it's roughly about 5% of our total carbon emissions come from air travel. And if ADHP was a country, we would be 41%. So it's a bit of an issue. And then if we look at trends, air travel trends over time, you can see that the graph is climbing exponentially. So this graph starts back in 1960 and finishes in 2015. And you can see that the exponential growth has resulted in a quadrupling of the output of CO2, although this is based on passenger miles, so aircraft have got a little bit more efficient over time. But this graph is actually passenger journeys. But you can see that it sort of quadruples since 1990. We've had a massive increase in the number of passenger flights. And when you look at global air travel over the years and break it down by income, so the green line being high income, the blue line being middle income, and the red line being low income, you can see that it's the high income earners that are consistently increasing the amount of air travel that they do. So growing trends in air travel. But suddenly, something changed. And so COVID came along and threw a spanner in the works of the air travel industry. And so when you look at the graphs, this is from Flight Radar, starting from the start of this year, so January the 1st, 2020. About March 15th, there was a significant drop-off in the total number of flights on a daily basis. And when you look at the number of COVID cases, you can see about March 15th is when the world began to take notice of COVID. Interestingly, you can also look at the carbon emissions around about that time. And you see that since 1970, the carbon emissions have been steadily increasing. And then in sort of February, March this year, for the first time in history, carbon emissions started to decrease. So we can clearly see that COVID has had a positive impact in global carbon emissions, although I suspect this is just temporary. So what does this mean for our CME in the post-COVID era, now that we're not able to travel? So most of you would have probably experienced having to make changes as a consequence of cancelled conferences. I looked up cancelled medical conferences, and you can see on Medscape they've started listing. This goes on for 6 pages, so 6 pages of cancelled conferences, and that was published on March the 9th. So this is early in the COVID story. So with all these cancelled conferences, and now that we're not able to fly, what are we going to do? How are we going to continue with our CME? How are we going to get our international holidays that a lot of people tack onto the side of their CME activities? So we've been forced to stop flying. Planet Earth has been able to take a brief breath, but we've adapted. So we've started using teleconferencing. So Zoom has become, I think it featured in this year's top words in the English Oxford Dictionary, you know, the yearly list of words that they publish, so Zoom is in there. So we've all had to become familiar with Zoom. Some of us are better at it than others. You may recognise my colleague down here on the bottom left. We've actually had to do a lot of stuff in-house. So we've bought a lot of the workshops in-house. You know, no longer are we sort of flying to Australia to a one-day workshop to do this or that. You know, we're doing, and particularly for me in anaesthesia, we're doing a lot of our training, intubation training and failed intubation workshops and all that stuff. We've brought a lot of that back in-house. And we're doing things locally. So we're organising local meetings. So, I mean, you guys are all in Wellington at a local meeting, but a lot of specialties have all sort of, rather than us all fly to the international cardiology something or other, or the international surgical something or other, we're becoming quite good at actually making national conferences. So Zooming, bringing things in-house and doing things locally have made us adapt to the consequences of COVID in terms of our CME activities. So the big questions is we had a anaesthetic sustainability group teleconference a couple of days ago, and we discussed this topic. And so one of the questions is your CME really suffering as a consequence of COVID? So, you know, are you meeting your CME requirements? Do you think that you will fail to meet your specialty's CME requirements as a consequence of not being able to travel? And what impact will this have on the future of your CME? So what will your CME activities look like going forward? So we've seen that, you know, we can actually do CME without jet setting to Rome to have a plate of pasta every 6 months. We can actually do a lot of our CME activities in-house. And, you know, can we continue this type of CME activity into the future? And we need to be mindful of the environmental impacts of our CME activities. So although you know, we've stopped our travel not because we've got an environmental conscience, we've all stopped travel because of COVID, but there are some lessons that we can learn from this. And then hopefully we can look at our CME activities, bear in mind the environmental impacts of that, and continue with our CME pretty much similar to what we're doing at the present. So there was a article published in Nature about this very topic. I only received this the other day, but in it were a number of recommendations, pretty much similar to what we're already doing, saying that you should localise meetings, that if conference organisers are organising conferences, that rather than have, you know, 4 or 5 1 or 2 day conferences throughout the year, that maybe we bring the conferences and bring all the special interest groups and all the associated activities and make it into one big event, sort of a 4 or 5 day event. Virtual technology, Zoom, should be paramount to this. We shouldn't be flying people from the other side of the world to give a 2-hour talk at a conference. It's quite possible to do that via Zoom. Obviously, it takes a bit of learning. The vibe's a little bit different, but it is quite a plausible way to conduct a conference. So just in summary, I realise I've got 5 minutes left. So just very quickly, we've realised that healthcare has a significant carbon footprint, and I would strongly encourage you to ask or challenge your DHBs to engage in carbon reporting. I think there are only 4 DHBs in the country that do that at the moment. I know some DHBs have been asked to do that and given up because it's too difficult, but in actual fact they may be forced to do that as a consequence of the Zero Carbon Act. But you can't fix a problem until you can quantify the problem. And if we're talking about environmental impact and carbon output, then we need to know what the sources of those carbon outputs are. We know that from our DHB and from the other DHBs that do report their carbon output, that air travel is perhaps the biggest, or certainly a major contributor to the carbon footprint. We've seen that COVID can prove to us that we can actually change the way we do things. We can make real and positive changes, although, you know, it's been forced upon us, that we've actually been able to do that. And we can actually engage in our CME activities without too much suffering as a consequence of loss of air travel. So at the moment, we're kind of in this position where, you know, we've acknowledged the fact that CME activities have a significant carbon impact. We know that healthcare has a significant carbon impact. We know that we can have the ability to change that. And so I would say that probably now is a prime time for us all to sort of sit down and have a think about what the future of our CME activities will look like. And just finally, if you are going to Zoom, then I've certainly made a steep learning curve. It's definitely worth looking at some advice on the internet. There's some really good videos on how to get the lighting right, invest in a decent camera, invest in a decent microphone, work out the positioning. I mean, there's nothing worse than trying to have a virtual meeting with somebody who's got their cell phone on their lap, you're looking up their nostrils with the light behind them and you can't see their face and you can hardly hear them. So, you know, spend a little bit of time working out on how to video conference properly. You've certainly got a lot of CME money that you're not spending now that you could invest in some decent teleconferencing equipment. All right, thank you very much. So I'll be open for questions. I have to be guided.
Marty, we do have a few questions. We don't have much time, although I note it would be eating into afternoon tea, so maybe we can be a little bit liberal. It depends how thirsty you all are. It feels like we barely had lunch. Jenny Henry has noted that in Northland, our DHB carbon offset all DHB flights using ECOS. If every SMO in our DHB contributed $100 of their CME annually to ECOS, that would carbon offset their CME flights. How about ASMS promoting this? Well, there's a good provocative multi-layered question. Marty.
So I carbon offset. I carbon offset all my flights, both my personal flights, and I use my CME to carbon offset. In fact, it was Rob and Dave and I that started beating this drum a couple of years ago. When I initially attempted to carbon offset, the DHB said, no way, you know, CME money is funded by Vote Health, it's for educational activities only, you're not allowed to use it for CME. But eventually we made an argument, and so I know that ADHB definitely allows you to offset your carbon footprint from travel. There is some debate about the merits of offsetting, and people say, oh, well, you know, it's just an excuse to travel, you're not really solving the problem. But that's not so true. And if you actually use a independently verified scheme like ECOS, and even Air New Zealand's carbon offsetting scheme, then there are clearly demonstrable benefits to that in terms of carbon offsetting. We just need to be careful of what carbon offsetting scheme you use. So do a bit of homework when it comes to that. So like I say, independently verified. You don't want to use a carbon offsetting scheme that's just planting pine trees all over the country. You need to use a decent carbon offsetting scheme like Air New Zealand's that invests a lot of its money back into restoring native forest, because we know that in the long run, native forest is a much better carbon sink than pine forests.
Thanks. So there's a request that you share your slides because some people want to have a closer read of them, and I'm sure that will be possible. There's a quick question about how does the quantity of single-use plastic items in healthcare compare with other contributors to climate change, and is it measured? Just a tiny question for you.
So that's my other bugbear, is the single-use plastic. It's a major problem, a real problem. It's partly driven by the manufacturers. You know, they're selling us single-use, it's cheaper, it's better, blah, blah, blah. It's got less environmental impact. You know, there's a little bit of brainwashing in terms of single-use items. I know that we're trying to go back to multi-use items as much as possible. I'm not sure if you're aware of the activities of a company like MedSalve, which is repricing the sequential calf depression devices in some hospitals. Difficulty getting some of the hospitals on board with that. We've just started a trial of reprocessing hover mats by MedSalve, but the problem is every DHB is a little bit different, and so where there's discussion about whether we have a national sort of sustainability advisory group in terms of product procurement and life cycle analysis. So yes, definitely waste, hospital waste is a major issue. And another talk I gave about hospital waste, New Zealand has a enormously high kilogram per bed per day waste output. And so single-use plastics are a major issue. I think if you're interested in that, the best way to deal with it is to tackle it as little bites at a time. So find a single-use plastic item in your area of work and see what you can do to get rid of it or fix it or at least recycle it. So we got rid of those drug trays, that was in the ASMS thing. We're starting a trial of syringe recycling at the moment, so that's not reusing the syringes. But because you can segregate the syringes into a single type of plastic, in other words, you've got a segregated waste stream, that's actually worth something to some people. So we're only in the pilot stage. It's only in a couple of operating theatres at ADHB, but we've collected 1/4 of a tonne of syringes that are not contaminated with human fluids, so no blood or CSF or urine or anything. So, like a syringe that you've drawn up a bit of Kefsol or propofol or morphine or whatever in. And so they're being collected up and they will be processed by a company called Future Post. But like I say, still a trial at this stage, still trying to sort out a few thick kinks. But if you have a single-use item in your area of work, look at it, work out where it's come from, how it's made, are there viable alternatives? But plastic waste for sure, big problem.
I'm really sorry, but I'm going to park the rest of the questions for now, although those of you following on Slido will see what they are. And there's a couple of really meaty, challenging ones, Marty, that we're going to pick up in our MECA discussion tomorrow, which is also a closed session, which I think will be a more appropriate session. But one of them refers to an elephant in the room and whether you know what that might be. So we can all reflect on that for a little while.
Well, if you can send them to me, I can
yeah, we will forward a bunch on to you as well. It's not that we're ditching them, except that I'm also conscious that the Unity pop-up bookstore will be here for us, and so you need time to be able to enjoy that before the final session of the day after afternoon tea, which is the Writers Who Doctor. But Marty, thank you so much for zooming in.
Okay.